Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Focus Week. And I can't believe we're on Thursday already. I hope you've all really enjoyed all the activities and downloaded some of the research that we've been sharing with you over the course of the week. And of course, we've got lots more to come too. And during the course of the whole week and today's conversations, do take part in the event chat, share your insights and things you've most enjoyed, things you want to catch up with, and maybe any questions that you might have as well in the event chat. And you'll find that button just over on the left hand side of your screen there. You can just join in with the rest of the network. And we're really pleased today to be talking to a procurement influencer. I'm sure I can call you that, Jon. He's a well-known blog. In fact, probably one of the first blogs on procurement, well before they were fashionable, known as Procurement Insights, and been following that for some time, Jon. But before we continue, perhaps you want to just introduce yourself a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ellen. Yeah, it's interesting when you say an influencer. I've been in high tech 40 years and procurement almost as long. So influence comes by longevity to a certain degree. And the Platform Procurement Insights blog I launched in May 2007. In 2009, I launched the radio show PI Window on the World, which was the first podcast for procurement. And it's just a great journey overall because you get a chance to really gain a broad horizon perspective, if you will, on how the industry has evolved. And I think that's really where you see a lot of the interesting stories and subplots happening here. So, but yes, definitely procurement insights. I also do ghostwriting and public speaking, not as much as I used to do, but nonetheless, through mediums such as these, I can do it a little bit more frequently without having to travel.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That's the beauty of what's come out of, I guess, what's been a very difficult time for everybody. It's just this way to be engaged. I know, obviously, you and I were engaging online over webinars, etc., for a number of years, but it's just mushroomed, and much more people are sharing their experiences over various different platforms online, and particularly on LinkedIn as well. And I think that's great to have that sharing, and therefore you get much more experience from everybody, and then you can learn on the back of that. It's able to sort of share that experience much broader than perhaps we were able to do before. So this morning, we're going to be talking about a topic which I know is dear to your heart and to mine. What does value mean to you? And I know that we've talked about this before, and certainly you've talked about it before, about value and how you can define that. But what do you think in that procurement can ever truly get away of thinking about value in terms of price and cost?
Well, it's an interesting thing. I say I don't look at value as being an equal to cost. I think we have to expand as a profession our definition of what value entails. Let me give an example. You're just talking about the pandemic. Prior to the pandemic in 2019, CPOs indicated that they want to focus more on this value element. They want to bring greater value to the organization. When the pandemic hit, many reverted to the familiar, which is how do we drive cost savings? How do we extend payment terms to suppliers who are themselves going through a difficult time, but we've got to preserve cash flow. So it was almost like a reversion to what we knew all along, to that limited definition of what value is. Now, the smarter organizations, some of the more innovative ones, and I think this is the reflection or the comparison to how value is evolving. A lot of them looked at it, for example, in terms of longer payables, giving us, instead of 30-day terms, 90-day terms, went to their suppliers and said, okay, we're going to pay you in 1 to 2 days. You'll give us a discount and we'll keep the cash flow going through to you. Now, their foresight in that regard was that, suppliers only have so many cycles. They have only so many customers they can serve. The ones who they're going to focus on are the ones who are going to work with them to get through the crisis. That's value. That's value added of the relationship itself. Now, there's an organization, Facebook, for example. I was amazed by this when I was talking to their head of diversity, where they indicated that, look, not only did we pay our invoices early, but for our suppliers, especially the small, medium enterprises, the diverse
Mm.
enterprises, we actually paid the invoices owed by other companies that bought from them, with the understanding that when they finally collected from those companies, that we would get paid back. Now, who do you think those suppliers are going to be most loyal to? Who do you think those suppliers are going to give their very best to? And so that's value. I think, realistically speaking, we don't, it's not an either or. We don't say, well, we can't do price anymore. What we
Hmm.
say is we recognize the broader definition of what value is, and recognize its impact not only within the traditional boundaries of an adjunct financial department, but in an overall stakeholder arrangement, both internal and external stakeholders.
Trying to look at it in a broader way, and trying to get those different elements on board with it as well. And it's interesting what you're saying about what the interpretation of payment terms and how they were working with the smaller suppliers. It's what we've heard quite a lot during the course of the pandemic, and I think that the hope and the belief is now that they can continue doing that afterwards too, and it's not just something which people have implemented and thought about during that, but actually see the value afterwards as well. It, often, or not, maybe not often, but sometimes finance can be a bit of a stumbling block here. Do you think, or is there a way that you can bring finance on board with this idea about value being not just about price, or do you find that they are already on board with this in some cases?
See, it's an interesting discussion, interesting point you raise. Many, many years ago, back in 2006, 2007, 2008, I researched and wrote about Robert Rutsky's book, Straight to the Bottom Line, how procurement professionals had to start thinking in terms of finance people. And part of the motivation of that was the CFO's general consensus in a variety of studies, saying that they just do not believe that procurement adds any substantial contribution to the bottom line outcome of the company. And that's what
Right.
drives finance. So, this bridge between finance and purchasing and procurement has been, it's been uncrossable, it seems, and it's still a question today. The reality is that we have to look as a profession and see that it's gone beyond ourselves, those functional silos, those hard lines in the sand that define what a CIO does, what a CFO does, what a CPO does. Those are now blurring
Mm.
considerably from what they were before. So you look at it, for example, and you say, okay, let's give a context of finance, understanding your impact. Organizations are looking at that and they're saying, well, shipping delays are a problem. Look what's happening with Walmart and Target now with their overstock inventory. They don't know where to put it. I read an article this past week where Walmart said that their whole warehouses and employee rooms are stacked with inventory that isn't selling. That bullwhip effect. They got inventory in anticipation of the buying habits continuing that occurred during the height of the pandemic, and of course
Mm.
they didn't. So how do you deal with that? How do you build that relationship? That's a financial question because they've got a lot of inventory that's costing them money and space. On the other side, they're looking at it from a supplier standpoint. How do we deal with suppliers? Do we force them to take some of it back? What is our practice? Are we working on a collaborative basis or a predatory basis? And so you can no longer look at it and say, finance is finance, IT is IT, procurement is procurement. Progressive organizations are now realizing that there are no hard silos, and definitions have to happen. And just at a dimension of that discussion, in early 2000, CIO magazine ran a survey back then, and they said, number one, are CIOs still going to be relevant in another 10 years? Number two, CIOs have to get out of the IT department and mingle with more stakeholders. Their role is being changed to the point that they even said, should we even be called CIOs anymore? So everybody is going through this shift and change. And procurement's influence, which has been elevated to a new level of understanding, has an opportunity to play a dominant role in that. So, what do you do to bridge that gap? You bridge that gap by understanding that there is a broader impact of supply chain. You understand where that impact occurs, how it occurs, and what your responsibility is. And I mean that's really the key part of it is that I no longer think we have these, again, hard lines in the sand where we got to make people communicate. I think everybody's coming together, the progressive companies, and are understanding the extended impact of procurement and supply chains, even more so after the pandemic. And how do we
Mm.
engage? How do we engage that more effectively?
Yeah, some interesting points that you've put across there, John. And it's interesting. We ran a survey just at the beginning of this year, and we were looking at how companies are starting to collaborate more, particularly across finance and procurement. And we found that around 29% of companies are actively looking to change their end-to-end procure to pay process and have that headed up by one person, and actually to become one holistic department, with the view to having that visibility across a lot of their processes, and where those different elements of process connect. And then sometimes that's been done by shared KPIs, and that's where I think I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but that's where I think things have the chance to become better, and conversely can fall down, where you have different departments where too much ego gets in the way of companies working together. And I think there's a job to be done there, where you can, and perhaps, business partnering can come into play here as well, where you can actually see the different departments working together to one common goal.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like for example, cybersecurity. Do you realize that more than 50%, I think it's something like 53% of all enterprise breaches occur through a third party supplier?
Mm,
Who's responsible for that? Who owns the relationship? Is that an IT problem only, or is it a
mm,
procurement IT problem that has to be worked out together and take ownership? With the increase on data privatization, all of these things in protecting data, a lot of organizations, and Supply Chain Digest did an interesting survey. They said, who owns the data? And there's new legislation being passed that companies have to be accountable for the data throughout their entire extended chain. And the majority of CPOs said they had no idea what their suppliers were doing with data. And if there was a problem, it was the general belief that it was up to the supplier to fix the encroachment, even though the ripple effect is that you can end up having a vulnerability. And as I said to the original statistic, a majority of enterprise breaches, which is the whole enterprise, occur through a third party supplier. Who owns that relationship? Who should be
mhm,
in the lead of that relationship? How should we manage that relationship? And just an extended note, for example, to add an added sense of urgency, I mean, procurement professionals have to become familiar with terms such as dwell time. I don't know if you know what dwell time is, but the reality is on average, it takes a company between 6 and 9 months to identify that a breach has occurred, and another 90 days before they can correct it. So that's 1 year that
mhm,
imagine somebody rummaging through your house looking for your valuables. You give them a year to do that, they'll do a lot of damage. And so, we have to become familiar with those terms so we can speak the language of the other stakeholders. And they have to be familiar with our role in this. And I think that's what's happening is this pandemic has awakened people to realize that supply chain and procurement isn't about just getting the best price, that there is an extended impact on all areas of our life.
exactly. And that's where you've got to rethink the term value, because I think you see it on a page, or you see it on an email, you're looking at value, you think, okay, well, that means one thing, but actually it's much more complex than that, as we've been talking about so far this morning. So you mentioned a little bit about Facebook as we started the conversation, and what they'd been doing. But have you seen other examples of innovation between uh, what's been happening, perhaps with payment terms, but it could be with other things, where achieved better supplier relationships, for example?
Well, and I mean, there's more of what you could say are generic examples. More and more companies, not to the degree of Facebook, but certainly more and more companies are starting to move in that direction.
Mm,
I've moderated panel discussions, for example, when you talk about relations, and let's look at diversity and all of those factors coming into play, and ESG, and
mhm,
and what that means. For example, everyone's talking about diversity. I remember one interview with a senior executive from a large global 500 company, and we were talking, and he said, "Look, we're going into diversity, but we've got to make it work more than an acute response situation. And what he was saying is that, and I don't know how many people know this, but diversity initiatives were launched in the late '60s in Michigan and Detroit during the riots then, and some equate that with what happened with Floyd, etc. But the automotive industry was the first industry to actually start looking at diversity. And once the acute crisis passed, all of a sudden it became a what you call a technical program of checks and balances, and it became perfunctory rather than proactive. And so here we are, from the late '60s to where we are now, 2022, and now we're talking about the importance of ESG again. We're talking about the elevated importance of all of these things. Well, they've been around for a long time. So the real question that comes out of this is, can procurement collaborate beyond a crisis situation? And can that collaboration be sustainable? And one of the biggest cases I talk about was the I-35 West bridge collapse. I was interviewed for an article in Forbes on this, and originally I heard the story from Kate Matasic. And what it was is the bridge collapsed. It was a famous, infamous event where a lot of people died and lost their lives. And of course, the main artery between the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there was a sense of urgency during the crisis to rebuild it. So what did organizations do? What did the buying? They abandoned their normal procurement practice, the government, the state, and they worked on an open book framework of collaboration to rebuild a bridge within 18 months using advanced architecture that nobody had done before. But they collaborated. Well, that bridge got built on time, on budget. And part of the motivation was not only restoring the artery, but giving honor to the people who did die through that tragedy. 18 months, they did it. The next bridge project, they reverted back to the way procurement usually works when it comes to value. And the bridge ran over time and over budget. A crisis situation. So the real question I think we all have to be asking ourselves is our memories going to be longer with the pandemic? Is our memories going to be longer with the geopolitical instability in the world, what's happening, war in Ukraine, etc., so that we actually have a stake in the ground? Are our diversity and ESG initiatives going to be going on beyond good intention to not let us find ourselves another 10, 20 years having this same conversation? So the reality is I think it's not a recognition that we have to do it. It's whether or not we have the will and the persistence to do it. And that's really what it comes down to. And that's going to make a lot of procurement people uncomfortable who are more functional rather than strategic. But the reality is you have to broaden your horizon of what you define as being a procurement professional, and step forward.
Yeah, and I think it's, as you say, it's about maintaining that, isn't it? And carrying forward with that momentum. And I think as human beings, not just in procurement, but in other areas of our lives, we're much too prone to doing things like straight away when it needs to be done, and then sitting back and relaxing. But perhaps here it's where we obviously something needs to be done and needs to be carried forward continuously. But perhaps with any program, and you might say that it's a transformation program if we're talking about value in this way. Perhaps you might say that this is where technology can come into play as well, because you've got the process there and you've got the technology which keeps us on our toes and makes sure that we have got some of those checks and balances in place that we're able to report on. And we all know if we're being reported on something, we're going to make sure that we do it. And so perhaps we need to have that kind of thing in play so that we can be sure to carry it forward and keep on doing so.
Well, technology is in, because like I said, I started in the IT industry 40 years ago, and I've seen the evolution. I actually, through funding from the Government of Canada's Scientific Research and Experimental Development Program, I developed one of the industry's first web-based procurement solutions for the Department of National Defense in Canada first, and then the New York City Transit Authority. And what was interesting about technology, especially if you look at the old days of the ERP, they were saying it was too cumbersome. Procurement wasn't involved in the selection of the ERP. We were basically an afterthought and said, okay, now what do we have to do? People expected, well, when the new SaaS technology came out, when the on-demand technology came out, that would change everything, because the technology is amazing now. I mean, it's ubiquitous in that you're no longer in the era that I had evolved in, as no one ever got fired for buying IBM and dealing with big boys. You've now been able to say everyone that's out there with the technology, there is not a hitch in the technology. Yet here's an interesting thing, Alan. Back in 2019, Deloitte's CPO Global Survey reported that the majority of CPOs who implemented a digital transformation strategy were disappointed with the results. Think about that for a moment. The
Mm.
technology had evolved. It became intuitive. It became like the Amazon home buying experience, yet they couldn't make that work. So all of a sudden now, unlike years past where technology was cumbersome, where reporting wasn't available and information wasn't there, the technology barrier has now been removed. We don't have a technology problem. Now we have, and it comes back to the people problem. And I don't mean to say people are the problem, but the reality is that uh, people use technology, not technology using people. And so organizations now are finding we have to redefine how we do things, how we communicate, how we collaborate, how we define value, so we can properly leverage the technology. And there's several key linchpin approaches on that. For example, Dr. Robert Hanfield, someone I've known for many, many years, once said that digital transformation is impossible without clean data. Well, how do you get to clean data? You talk to, I remember talking to one of the top people in procurement in Scotland, government of Scotland, who happens to have a successful initiative, one of the few, very much like Virginia's EVA program. And they were saying, well, we know that the data isn't clean. We know that there's parent-child skew problems. We know that there's complexity in there that adds to the inventory we carry unnecessarily, but we don't have the cycles to clean up the data. So
Mm-hmm.
subsequently speaking, and this is the thing, I mean, CDC reported that, or not CDC, IDC reported that only 5% of all data is ever analyzed. Well, tell me something. How do you leverage technology without clean data? How do you leverage the speed and capability of technology when only 5% of it is ever analyzed? And so who should be in the lead of that? Who should be on the governance of that? And many organizations do not have data governance team set up, of which procurement must be an integral part. So I think that if you look at those areas, the technology is now off the hook. We can no longer point to technology being a problem. What we now have to do is look at our own mindset, approaches, our collaboration, what our role and responsibilities are as procurement professionals.
Hmm. And making sure that you do that work up front, because I don't know about you, but we still hear from so many companies who only they don't look hard enough or long enough at their existing processes before they implement a new technology solution, and still think to some extent that the technology is going to be the answer to all of their problems, without looking at the problems first and where their processes are perhaps not are broken in some ways. And I think that today's world, where as we've just been talking about, where all of those departments need to be connected and need to have visibility, well, if those departments at the moment are not connected by people, the technology is not going to make that any better. So I think any relationship has to depend on the people that are within it, and I think that goes with the technology as well. And so thinking about value, as we have been doing so far in this conversation, what would you say to companies that still are quite critical about it? People who are listening today and thinking, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But actually, when it comes to it, I still need to think about value in terms of pricing. What would you say to those companies who are perhaps what we might think not thinking about it in the way that maybe they should be?
Well, and again, I'll go back to here. Value and pricing aren't the same thing.
Mm,
But you can't exclude pricing and cost consideration from the value equation. Again, I think the biggest mistake you can make is either or.
yeah.
And that's really the key element of that. Give you an idea, and this is the ramification strategy. I met with one of the largest retailers in the U.S. many years ago. This is about 2005, I think, 2004. And they had gone through what they called a vendor rationalization strategy. This is an interesting story. They said, we're going to cut down the number of vendors we deal with to 100 because they were huge. And what we would do is get volume discount, streamlined processes, and
Hmm.
we'd be able to save some money. And certainly right out of the gate, they were able to realize some significant savings. But when they had called me in, they said, do an analysis of what our savings really are. It turned out that they were paying about 20 to 25% above the going market rate for the items they were buying. Why did that happen? Well, what happened is their reality shrunk to those 100 suppliers. So their
Yeah.
savings were based upon what they drove through those existing suppliers. And there were initial savings to be captured. The problem was they weren't sustainable. And what ended up happening is with only dealing with 100, they removed themselves from the bigger marketplace. Now, part of their
Mm.
challenge, in all fairness, was the old ERP platforms were very cumbersome with supplier onboarding, management, getting data, getting information. The new technologies streamline onboarding. The data is easily captured in real time. So what ultimately happens is you should be dealing with more suppliers rather than fewer suppliers, depending on what you're buying. This was indirect materials, MRO support, etc. Depending on what you're buying, that's where you can leverage technology. But if you go and look at the technology and say, okay, I'm going to apply the same mindset that caused me to do a vendor rationalization to what technology can do today, your results are going to be abysmal. You're going to get that initial pop of savings, but it's not sustainable. And so that's
Mm.
what you have to change the mindset. And it goes back to what I wrote about from the very beginning in Procurement Insights blog. I wrote about people, process, technology. And when I started writing about that, it was funny, but that wasn't a term people looked at. Everyone was looking at technology and process, and then let's get the people on board. And they ran into maverick spend. They ran into resistance because a lot of the buyers on the front line knew that they could beat the price of a centrally negotiated contract, especially in areas such as indirect materials. So, realistically speaking, you've got to look at it saying, what's people first, process, and then how do we leverage the technology? And today that's becoming more common, but we've got to get it beyond being a punchline or that old, the old win-win type of saying, which has absolutely no value. We also have to abandon some of the things. There's the old days of people don't get what they deserve; they get what they negotiate, and it's an adversarial zero-sum game.
Mm.
Kate McCaskill, I'll go back, talked about her days working with Microsoft and how they were actually rewarded in the procurement department by getting the lowest price possible. So the incentives were geared towards that, but that alienated suppliers. And I think that that's the realization of the broader spectrum. You have to look at the people, the process, and the technology. But technology will not fix bad process, and it certainly won't win people over. So
No.
that's mindset.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's making sure that you're thinking of the people and bringing them with you, and making sure that each side. I know you said a win-win there, and those kind of things can be buzzwords, but of course you need to believe in it, and there actually has to be something, some tangible thing in it. So when you're talking to the team, whether it's procurement or whether it's finance, and you're saying that there's going to be something in it for but perhaps for your suppliers and for both sides of the coin. I think that both sides have to truly understand and believe that, and then see that as a result. I think when it is just words, then it just, as soon as people see that what they were hoping for hasn't come out of it, I think that then that they switch off, and then it becomes a process which they don't no longer believe in. And I think that you have to have the people within your team believing in the new transformation program or an implementation program, whether that's process or technology. They have to see the results of that. Otherwise, you've lost them, and that goes for I think the suppliers as well. I mean,
Yeah,
what?
sorry to interrupt, but the only way you
Mm,
get to that point goes back to our other talk. What we said at the earlier on, the collaborative process. The vendor rationalization strategy was a financial decision.
mm,
Procurement wasn't involved in that decision to provide the impact. And so what ultimately happened is that they got the marching orders saying to do this, and procurement people are saying it's not going to work or it's not working. I'm paying a higher price or a higher premium. And
mm,
so what you had there was the lack of understanding of what's the line of sight consequences. I like to call that line of sight consequence. One of the reasons why EVA, for example, was so successful for all these years in Virginia is that they looked at the people, process, technology. They looked at getting the people involved in it and saying, does this make sense? What is the
Mm.
extended impact of the decision beyond the departmental? And I think that's really a critical element here, is that again, with technological advance, that's great, but does your organization have the ability to collaborate? And I mean, I'm not just talking about saying we're going to do it this way, but having people come around the table and say, okay, what'll happen with vendor rationalization? I'll tell you one little story. I gave a keynote in front of about 350 people from the automotive industry, and it was the powertrain transmission group. And I'll give you the numbers up front. Their Maverick spend in the US was 29%. In Canada, their Maverick spend was around 69%. And they want to know why. And what was interesting is I stood in front of this group of executives from the automotive supplier side of the equation. And I kid, I was going to talk about reverse auctions and the the emergence of technology. And to say that it was a group having pitchfork and torches would be an understatement. They didn't tell me, the organizers at the end, that technology and reverse auctions, all these things in that automotive industry, was a negative. They did place me deliberately at the front of the ballroom and the exit door way at the back, so I couldn't get through. So I had to sort of write it out. But one of the things that suppliers were complaining about is, look, we go through this process of qualification with procurement or through finance, and we get onto the contracts, we go through the legal things, we're expecting a certain volume to be purchased from us, and it's not happening. Why would we go through that? And then the procurement people, the purchasing people, are buying directly from suppliers they know can deliver the product better and cheaper and faster. So why would we become part of that exercise to never actually get the business to justify
Mm.
the investment in that relationship? So that was the disjointed communication, finance, procurement, the limitations of IT at that particular point in time. And going back to my earlier point, technology has now improved dramatically, but that link between people and process and people and communication and collaboration, that still has a long ways to go. And you
Uh,
can't collaborate with external partners effectively until you collaborate internally effectively.
what do you think can be done there? And particularly talking about in terms of my network between procurement and finance, what kind of things can help that collaboration piece to take place?
It starts at the top. It's and you got, as procurement professionals, you got to ask yourself a hard question. Is my organization part of the new
Mm.
emerging organizational mindset of procurement strategic importance? And let's be going back to what I said earlier. The pandemic was a critical flashpoint because it made everyone realize just how important procurement and supply chain is and the
Mm.
impact it has beyond just merely the acquisition of products and services at the lowest price. The trouble is that, will it stick with organizations? And I remember somebody asked me and saying, well, what if I get up the next morning, I go in and talk about all of this because it makes sense, but they still say, well, how much money did you save me on that acquisition or purchase? What do you do? And I said something quite bluntly. I said, well, you better look for another company who aligns with how you think, because organizations, if they don't change, will be left behind. And
Mhm.
and I think that's really a key element in all of this, because and let's look at adaptability and agility on a much bigger picture. Do you realize that 95% of the companies who were in the Fortune 500 list in 1955 are no longer around or on that
Mm.
list? Because they didn't have the agility to adapt. They didn't understand that. So you've got to look at it as a procurement professional and say, what organization with whom I'm working, are they progressive? Are they looking for this kind of communication and collaboration? It begins at the top. Procurement can't do it on their own. They can
No,
understand it, but they can't do it on their own. You need to have progressive management doing that. And I think that is so critical. One side note, we did a study, a series of surveys and polls at a conference. And we asked the procurement professionals, if you had to do it all over again, would you choose purchasing and procurement as a profession? And more than 50% said no. Now, here was the interesting thing that surprised me, is out of that 50% that said no, I was thinking it'd be mostly people who've been around a long time, the old school
mm,
procurement people, but the newer generations, a good percentage was the new generation Z, the other generation coming up, and they weren't happy with it. And on average, procurement cycle times, even up to senior management, is between 18 and 24 months of new hires. So, you have that instability. So that's what you've got to address. All the technology in the world won't replace that. All of the good advice and the good sentiments about what we have to do won't replace that. You actually need to see meaningful change starting at the top in your organization.
No, absolutely, absolutely right. And I think that's interesting that you're saying there about, people who are in that organization and perhaps don't feel like they're being supported in their onward journey towards better or further digitization, and feel like their career is in a company which is forward thinking. They don't stay there anymore. They leave. And I think if you're an organization who is thinking that they don't need to address some of the issues that we're talking about today, you're probably going to lose the best talent within it. And no organization wants to be left with the people who are just happy with the way that things are, and are not, because slowly but surely that eats away at the organization as a whole. So I know, I think you're absolutely right. And if you're a company who is in the fortunate or well considered position of being more forward thinking, what sort of soft skills do you think, or what sort of skills do you think that they should be looking for the talent that's coming forward? Because we talk about it's important to engage with the right people within your teams, but part of that, of course, is the process of getting those people in your teams in the first place. So if you're, and I know some of the procurement process, certainly in the UK, actually includes the recruitment process as well. So what would you say people should be looking for those people within their teams?
Well, it's kind of interesting, but the root problem begins with the recruiting process. I was interviewing Ian Campbell McKenna from Sourcing Salt, and he was talking about the proliferation of technology. And this is where technology is not a good thing, where
Mm,
technology in recruiting has reduced the search of hundreds of resumes to keywords. So it'll go through the keyword search, and that'll be the filtering process. Yet there was an interesting story. A senior CPO executive who had great experience, was perfectly aligned for a job position, didn't have the exact keyword matching that they had in the resume, and the system didn't recognize them. So when he
mm,
submitted his resume, which is easy to do, you can put out those 10, 20 a day. When it got his resume and it didn't have that keyword that particular employer was looking for, he received a rejection letter saying, you don't have enough experience and expertise in the area, but thank you for applying. And this was like a 10, 20-year veteran who had an exceptional record. So part of the problem is not just what you have to look for, but your process of engagement and looking. Your process of being able to say, how do we identify those soft skills? We talk about intelligence, we talk about sensitivity, the ability to adapt in a VUCA world. All of these elements, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, all of these things are very important. But
mm,
unless you get to that stage where you now haven't automated the process, or where you've automated the process that you're just looking for keywords, you're going to continue to miss. And again, I referred to this earlier, and this is a shocking statistic. The average new hire only lasts 18 months. And that goes right up to the senior management level. So now here's the chain. And this is, you've got to see how the chain all connects. Most, what you call automation initiatives, digital initiatives fail because they don't have the leadership to take them through there. And they say digital success comes from having a leadership that's firmly in place, that isn't just a byproduct of the perfect storm of circumstances. And I'll talk about that in a
mhm,
moment, but based upon bringing the people together and understanding and managing that process. Well, how do you have that if you have a turnover of 18 months into that degree? Now, the problem is that these pockets of success, that's what we have to look for, the models, the scalability. I'll go back to EVA. I'll go back to even the government of Scotland and their success with it. How do you make that scalable? How do you bring the right people? I talked with one individual who was part of a team in the U.S., a high traffic tourist place, and they wanted to really promote their convention center. And they went to IBM and they said, we want to host your global conference. And IBM said, look, we like the area, we like the region, we think it's great, but we don't think your facilities are up to snuff. So we're now looking for 2 to 3 years or a year down the road in terms of what we're going to do, because we already decided on the upcoming location. So this is what you'd have to do on the checklist. And the procurement group got together and said, okay, we have a short window of time to address all of these things, to rebuild, restructure our convention facilities so that we can start bringing and attracting in this, and landing IBM would be a big bonus. And this group worked together and pulled it off. And they had other successes. But then as time eroded, went by, teams members went to different locations, some retired, etc. New people came in, they couldn't replicate that. The reason they couldn't replicate it is they didn't have a system or process to do a replication. It was the right people in the right time at the right place. They didn't have the right methodology or the platform for that. So when you look at hiring, when you look at the soft skills, when you look at all of these other elements coming together, and you look at the high rate of turnover, you have to go back to the starting process of recruiting and say, how do we identify the skills and the people we can pull together who will have the synergies that'll be able to work and drive success and sustain that? How do we create scalable models of digital transformation that deliver consistent value? And I mean, that's really the key point there. I think we have to be able to become part of the hiring process, working with HR. Remember, we talked about collaboration. People look at procurement saying, well, you got to collaborate with finance. No, you do, but you have to collaborate with the IT department. You have to collaborate with the HR department. You have to have organizations that are intuitively connected and understand the line of sight impact of what each is doing so that they can not only accomplish their own individual objectives, but ensure that all the objectives are aligned. And that takes senior management, senior maturity, and senior responsibility to drive that. And if you don't have that in an organization, you'll bring on good people by chance, just by volume, but they won't stay.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right in a lot of the things that you said. They're really interesting to hear your viewpoint and your stories to share on all of that, actually, John. And I think that, well, here in the UK, and I know globally as well, we talk about the Great Resignation, and I think that some of the things that we've talked about just now, I think are part of that. And as you say, it's very difficult to move forward with a program if you're continuously losing people. But perhaps here there's the part to be played in augmented technology, so you're not just implementing a technology solution which filters through your applicants, but you actually have some human insight in that as well. And I think perhaps a lot of it goes into, again, back to the beginning of making sure your processes are right first of all before you implement any technology, and making sure you've got those people on board and you're having those conversations, whether, as you say, whether that's with recruit, whether with the HR department, whether it's with procurement or finance, like you say, tying those elements together. And it's not always easy, is it? I mean, you can make it sound easy, but it's not an easy thing. But once you've got a process in place, then it's that much easier to replicate, isn't it? I think. But
you have a platform, you have a manageable platform, a mandate, call it like a constitution of what you're going to do with the governance model, because it's also going to filter out people. We have to accept the fact as well that not all people are going to make that transition. With the D&D, they had a purchasing department of 21 people. Within 18 months, 12 to 18 months, we got them down to 3 people doing the work through automation. What do you do with those other 18 people? The resistance. Duncan Jones once over breakfast told me a story before he joined Forrester about how he was automating his organization's technology capability. And there was a gentleman behind a desk, behind a skyscraper of files. And, he was resisting the automation. And Duncan, as he relayed the story to me, if I recall correctly, went up and said, "Why are you resisting it?" Because the guy said, as long as I see a big stack of files on my desk, I know I have job security. And the reality is that there is going to be some painful changes in there. Not all procurement people are going to be able to make that transition. And not all organizations have the chops to be able to do that. I don't mean to minimize human impact in all of these things, but I do believe, and there was that famous Uber quote or tweet by the founder of Voxnet who said, We shouldn't build technology to improve the way the world does work. We should build technology to improve the way it should work. Not does work, but should work. And when you do
Absolutely.
that, then you're attracting the right people, and that's where that comes into play.
I mean, and perhaps that's where, we talked a little bit already about ESG, and perhaps where that's where that conversation comes into this as well, because increasingly organizations are being measured on their ESG performance. I mean, where do you see that our interpretation of value comes in here?
I don't mean to smile. Back in 2007, and I shared this paper that I wrote in 2007, talking about the greening of procurement and making reference to greenwashing and everything.
Mm,
And this is 2007. Now in 2022, I started seeing posts by different people who are quite knowledgeable and we're saying greenwashing is happening in procurement. We're seeing it still. And the reality is you've got to be able to, it's just like diversity, just like any initiative, you've got to be able to transition from being solely the right thing to do to being the smart thing to do. And there's a book many years ago called Cannibals Without Forks, or a book, I forget the name of it, but we talk about cannibals with forks and suggesting if cannibals have forks, have they actually progressed? And they were saying the problem is that you can have social transformation, but if you don't have capital transformation, you're not going to realize anything. So you've got to be able to practically make money at it. And I think the
mm,
biggest problem with this ESG now is that there is a push that's going to happen. But what does it take into account the reality of what's happening in the world? For example, in China, their middle class is growing at a phenomenal rate, the rate that it was in North America in the post-war years. There's not enough clean energy to go around. So there's still going to be the reliance on that. Coal prices just announced 2 days ago. Coal prices and demand have increased exponentially in the US. Why is that happening? Because you can move towards ESG, you can follow that path, but if it disconnects with the way in which the real world operates, if it disconnects and slows down the economy, what do you do on that basis? And so I think what happens is we have to be able to again show the financial gains that can be made
mm.
for doing the right things and not just the social gains. And that's really where the key is. You've got to bridge these things together.
And I think also a third point there is reputational as well, because I think that companies now, I mean, we talked a little bit about making sure that you keep the talent within your team. And I
Mhm.
think that particularly when you're talking about Generation Z, I think that, or the millennials, I think that they are looking to go to companies which are forward thinking. And a key indicator of a company being forward thinking is that their ESG performance is good and that their reputation for doing that and actually achieving that, not just saying that they have, like the greenwashing you talked about just now, but demonstrably are. And that goes in terms of, and I think when we talk about ESG, we're also talking about prompt payment code here in the UK that we have. Do they pay their suppliers on time, for example? How are they working with the structure that exists? And I think that there are key questions and pointers here that and I think reputation is one of them, because nobody wants to be known as an organization who doesn't achieve that, and therefore doesn't attract the talent that we're talking about, and then perhaps becomes one of those organizations which only keeps the talent that they've recruited for 18 months. You don't want to be that organization. um,
Wow.
so
Yeah,
what
I listen. You just raised an interesting point. Certainly, but you talk about two different divergent areas that come together. But statistically, knowing this, you're right. IBM did a survey about 7 years ago saying that the upcoming generation values the social responsibility of the company for whom they're working more
mm,
so than anything else. A study just came out this year saying the number one fear for the up and coming generation is they're not going to have enough money. Do
mm,
you see where there's a potential
mm,
disconnect there? So if you're worried about money and you're going to an organization that doesn't have hasn't found a way to financially make ESG make sense from a bottom line standpoint, those are two diametrically opposed elements there. So do you think these people will say, okay, I guess I won't make money, but I'll go to this company? And yes, there are organizations or people during the Great Resignation that are saying, look, money isn't what's going to drive us anymore. But most of those are the baby boomers.
Mm.
They're not going to drive us. We're going to make decisions that we're going to have some kind of a legacy with regards to our life. The reality is that the suggestion that doing the right thing is not the smart thing financially. That's the gap between the realization of it. Yes, organizations will attract talent if they have a sound ESG policy, but a sound ESG policy isn't just doing it, it's making it make sense financially. And I think that's where the vacuum comes into play here. I was wondering the other day, I was reading about Volkswagen replaced their CEO who was going to do changes and all these things. And one of the reasons they did was because of that big scandal, their carbon emission report. Yet Volkswagen is still in business. Yet Volkswagen is reverting back to some of the old ways they did things. So you look at it and say, okay, so how long is our memories on these kinds of things?
Well, I
What
think
is the real
possibly,
impact?
possibly that goes back to some of the things we were saying at the top of the conversation, and making sure that you as an individual, you as a company, carry that momentum forward, and don't stop and just react to the situation that's right in front of you, but put policies in place, and that goes for people and technology, that will make sure that you continue that that sort of motion forward, and actually can transform as a business into one which makes sense from a financial point of view, but also from an ESG and people point of view as well. But what do you think are the indicators that companies are getting this right, in terms of, going back to the topic about value? What are the key indicators that companies are getting this right, do you think?
Well, you know what? And again, it's like anything else, the scalability element of it. I mean, we're starting to see changes that are taking place with organizations based on social pressure, sustained social pressure. But I think we're at the early stage where we can't ask which companies are getting it right. We have to ask which companies are on the right path toward getting it
Mm,
right. If I look at an organization, I'll give an example of Facebook again with their diversity initiative of dealing with diverse suppliers. When you think of diversity, and goes to your earlier point, which I found interesting, was how many of would look at that and say, okay, we have diverse suppliers. How do we finance their receivables? We'll pay them early, but even if we pay them early, if they have other customers who are paying them slowly, they're going to be in trouble. How do we do that? Well, we'll finance other companies' payables to them,
mhm.
and they'll pay
Yeah.
us back. How many consider that part of an ESG strategy? How many consider that part of a diversity strategy? I don't think there's a lot of companies that do. Now, I'm not saying that's for everyone, but what I am saying is that you have to be able to say, where do I find, and it's an ongoing process, it's a moving target, where do I see beyond the checks and balances of, yes, I have this percentage of diverse suppliers, yes, I have this percentage of business going through them, but
Mm,
how does that equate across the broader spectrum? How are companies making money? Is everybody making money? Is payments being made quickly to suppliers? Is the diversity delivering and producing a better result for the end customer? Because you can have all the right things going on, but if you produce an inferior product that's more expensive, the market isn't going to buy it. So where does that leave you? So I think a lot of organizations are at various stages in this journey, but it's not a matter of a single static get it right. It's a matter
mm.
of continuously getting it right on a progressive basis as more knowledge comes in as to the impact of what you're doing.
And I suppose it goes back as well to what we were talking about making sure that you are being proactive. You're a forward-thinking business, forward-thinking department, and you're not just reacting to what's hitting you. And I suppose a part of being able to do that is making sure that you've got the right controls in place in the first place. But do you think that there are risks now that people should be aware of, or need to be aware of, that perhaps they aren't? I mean, you talked a little bit about uh, the Ukraine crisis, and well, what we have here that we're facing with on a kind of global scale. You've got sanctioned suppliers, for example, or examples of modern slavery. Do you think that the world is becoming more complicated in that sense, or is it just something which, again, we have to learn to be proactive about? And if we have got those controls in place, we can react and respond proactively. I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think the has always been complicated. I mean, I think what's changed is our awareness of that complication and the extended impact of what we have. The key, I think, is we're now in. I call this the great age of awakening and awareness. We have to be successful transition into the great age of sustainable proactive measures. And let me go back again. Remember, diversity started in the late 60s with suppliers in the automotive industry. Yet it never gained any meaningful cycle past that initial
Mm,
reaction to it. So you have to look at it as how do we move from awareness beyond a crisis point to make it sustainable? And those sustainable models, how do they make money? How do they capitalize? We have to have capital sustainability, not just social sustainability, but we have to have capital sustainability as well. And that's the reality of it. Good intentions aren't going to be enough. So,
mm,
yeah, I think if you're looking to work for someone, you don't look at it as, well, they've arrived, because you never do. You look at it as based on their mindset towards this. Are they progressive thinking, not just in terms of introducing new technology, but a mindset of how to do business? Are they progressive in their thought process of recognizing that they can't revert to the familiar, that they have to stay the course? Or if they are reverting to familiar, they have to question the validity of their strategy at this point in time. So that's really where you look at the organization, you measure it. I don't think anyone arrives, but I think people progressively and organizations progressively do the right things so that at a given moment they're maximizing the opportunity or the outcomes that they want to achieve.
I think that's great, and I think that that's so good as well that you actually have to have that in place with an organisation, that they need to be able to be flexible in the way that they think. And like you're saying, is yes, sometimes you might be okay to stay as you are, but I think that because quite often when we're looking at organizations and looking at them in terms of their technology and what are the existing barriers to technology, one of those is still we're happy with the way things are. I mean, there has to be a small percentage in those that are happy with the way that things are, and maybe everything's fine. But there's a much larger percentage of people who are happy with the way things are because they haven't looked at the different alternatives. And I think you're so right to say that the kind of people that you want in your team are those people who are going to be curious, going to keep on progressing with what they policy implementation and the process implementation, and of course technology as well, and people. So it's been great talking to you, Jon. Have you got any sort of final tips that you wanted to share with our network today?
Well, I think the thing for procurement, but for everyone within an organization, is you have to constantly seek to be in a state of discomfort. And why I say that is that, it comes down to, everyone talk about change management, Gleischer's formula, all of these factors that come into play. But the reality is until the discomfort gets to the stage where you want to take action, you'll never really move beyond that. So procurement professionals have to be in a state of discomfort. If you're comfortable or if you're apathetic with what you're doing, you're in the wrong place. What you need to do is you need to look at the way things are done, challenge them, but challenge them with facts and understanding, challenge them with a broader perspective beyond the procurement realm to recognize the extended impact of what you do. And if your company is responsive to that, then you're with the right company. If you're not, then you have to decide, if I'm comfortable with that, I'm going to stay where I am and just, count the hours on the clock, or I'm going to look for a company that can do that. And that's really what it comes down to in the individual level. That's where we as individuals gain control of our careers and our lives, and ultimately collectively impact business.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. On that note, I think it's a perfect finish there. Thanks very much, John. And I'm sure if anybody who is listening today wants to contact you or get some more insights from some of the things we've been talking about, they can find you on LinkedIn, and or of course they can also contact me, and we can put anybody in touch. But thanks very much, John, and thanks for sharing all of your insights. And to everybody listening, I hope you've enjoyed the session, and I will enjoy the rest of the sessions that we have coming up for you today. And we'll join us tomorrow for our final Focus Week day. Again, thanks very much, John. Take care.
Thank you for having me, Ellen.
It's a pleasure.